In this tutorial, we are going to be looking at critical links. This is like a recap really on how and sort of what makes a successful critical link. So in order to understand that, we need to really go back and recap on the assessment objectives. So here are the 4 assessment objectives. These are the same in all 4 art subjects. So I'll let you have a quick read over them. So as you can see, assessment objective 1 is the ability to analyse and research. In the assessment objective 2, it's the ability to develop an idea. AO3 is your ability to record, and AO4 is sort of the whole project, your ability to produce a project that's personal and meaningful, that has been influenced by relevant resources, etc. So in terms of the critical link, the main assessment objective that comes under is assessment objective 1. However, you will notice that I've put little arrows going to the other assessment objectives because they do all link. It's interesting really when you actually look at, say for instance, the assessment objective 3, the ability to record. We're assessing your ability to not only sort of take photographs, drawings, etc., but also the ability to record a project and how you have developed that project. And elements of the assessment objective 1, which is the critical link, comes under that bracket. And the same with the assessment objective 4. There's elements of that, has it been personal, has it been meaningful, have you drawn the right sort of conclusions and realised your intentions. So the critical link does sort of roll over onto all the assessment objectives really, but ultimately the main one is your assessment objective 1. And the thing to really highlight here is that you need to demonstrate your ability to analyse and also research, so that demonstration of analytical and critical understanding. So ultimately, how do we do that in a critical link? Well, these are the questions you need to be asking yourself really. So who the artist is, what it is that you're looking at, what's the piece of work, when was it produced. Sometimes this is incredibly important. Obviously, when you look at sort of looking back at art history, certain movements were very pivotal. Just for example, in design, Modernism was a very pivotal movement for graphic design. How the piece was made is sometimes incredibly relevant. And ultimately, the big question is why. Why has this artist made this piece of work? And what is it they're trying to say? So you've got to ask all those questions and answer them in your critical link. And the way that we do that is through research, but also with the use of diagrams, quotes, and again, is trying to sort of, in terms of the layout, does the layout reflect the artist or the designer's work? Now, this is something that the graphic design students are very good at. I know for others, it might be that it's not really appropriate. Editorial design isn't really covered by the artist or the photographer, etc. So I'm just going to go through a little bit. It's like a recap really on design or layout design. Before I begin to do a recap on layout design, I think it's incredibly important to keep in mind that actually the term layout design doesn't exist. It depends what you're designing for. So say for instance anything that's sort of print based, which could be magazines, etc., books, we class as editorial design, which probably would link the closest to critical links. However, there are things like UI design, like for websites, etc., and apps. So some of the principles that I'm about to talk through, you would be able to apply them to those design areas as well. But we are just going to focus on editorial. So editorial design has changed in the past 10 years or so, mainly because of the sort of creation of the tablet, so that be iPad or iPhone, etc. We're finding that more people today are viewing editorial content online. Now, that has obviously opened up a few doors for us and allowed us to do exciting things. However, some of the layout principles you can still apply to both printed and digital. So that's what I'm going to cover today. Now, in order to really understand editorial design, we've got to really look back at a really key time in art history, which was modernism.
In the early 20th century, the war to end all wars didn't end war at all. It stoked the fires of change. A traumatised world was ripe for change. The world was ready for modernism. Modernists wanted to forget history, or at least reinterpret it. More than just a style, modernism applied to virtually all forms of creative expression. Innovative artists like Picasso, Escher, Dali, they all started looking at their world differently. Other artists tried painting light itself. These were the Impressionists. Surrealists went a bit further. We had entered the age of the isms: Cubism, Symbolism, Futurism, Constructivism. All these new modern ways of looking at the world blew people away. When it came to architecture, modernists were intrigued by emerging technology. Concrete, glass and steel featured heavily in their buildings. Modernists believed that they could design a better society. Ornamental indulgence was considered a frivolous waste of effort. They thought function should always dictate form, and that mankind's intelligence, creativity and capability for radical thinking should be celebrated. Take the Russian inventor Georgy Krutikov. He suggested an idea for a city held aloft by electrical currents. This at a time when there was barely enough wattage to keep the lights on. Not everything they designed was a resounding success. But you could argue modernism was the single most influential movement of the 20th century. From house music to housewares, tables and chairs to graphic design, all have been created by the aesthetics and ideas of modernism.
So let's focus on some of those values that we see in modernism. So the idea of function should always follow form. And then when we look at graphic design of that period, you can see there was a massive shift. There was a clear move towards function, really sort of simplifying layouts, the focus really being on the viewer and how they can interact with the piece of design. Now, the designer that really influenced this movement was a typographer called Jan Tschichold. And he produced a book called The New Typography, and it was basically like a manifesto on a new vision for the way that we can use typesetting. And embedded in that was what we know today as the grid system. So here is an example of one of those grids. Now, arguably, this is one of the most important pieces of design that we've seen in the 20th century. I know what you're thinking, it's just a bunch of lines, but it's far more than that. What this doing is it is dividing our page up equally. Now, to make this simpler, and I'll show you how you can apply this to a design, first thing we need to do is highlight some anchor points. So here you can see I've highlighted some anchor points, and then if I connect them together, you'll see that two boxes appear. Now, Tschichold believed that if you placed your information along these lines, or in this case within these boxes, it would make it easier for the viewer to engage with the work. So I've designed a very quick layout here with some text and some headings using that grid system. Now, as you can see, it's very easily accessible. I can easily read this, and it flows beautifully. And that's what he wanted to try and do, create a set of rules that people can apply to their design work that inevitably make it better. Now, that grid system is one of thousands. There's a few on the screen here. The way to view the grid system is to just see it as dividing your page up, whether that be into 2, 3, 6, whether it is to be divided horizontally or vertically. But you need to think about how you would lay the material out and how people would interact with your design. So really consider how the grid system can help with your layout. Now, anyone that's really interested in modernism after that and really wants to sort of do some more research into the grid system, there's some artists here that are definitely worth looking at, the typographers, etc. So have a look at them. And these are books that are also available in our library. Anyone that really wants to, learn more about editorial design, whether it be the grid system or not, or typography in general, the graphic design, The New Basics is a great book to get started with. Now let's look at applying the idea of the grid system to your critical links. Now, for lower six, we ask you to record your research in the form of a critical link. Now, there's two variations. There is the gallery sketchbook, and then there is the critical links that go in your sketchbook or sometimes on an A1 board. But before we do that, here are the initial planning stages to your critical links. So the first thing is looking at information. The second is deciding on the grid system, so how the audience is going to view your work. And then finally, typography selection. So let's start off with the information. So this is like gathering your research, etc. So this would include sort of headings, subheadings, text, images, quotations, things like that. Now, as you're gathering that information, ensure that it's relevant to the work that you want to sort of develop. It needs to link. Artists do lots of variations of different types of work. So please make sure that it's the work that you're selecting is relevant. The second as well is you need to think of how the reader will view the information. So sometimes it's easier to add more quotes or have more imagery in your link. And lastly, we need to think carefully about how we can embed some of those ideas into the layout. And the grid system is going to help us do that. So that's the next phase. So here's my information that I've gathered. So this is something that we do in the lower six. It's called the camera, and it's an introduction to the camera obscura. So you can see here I've got my headings, I've got my subheading, I've got the body of text, some images, make sure they're high quality images, that's really important. And then I've got some quotes as well. So this is all the information that I'm going to include in my critical link or my research page. So now let's think about the grid system. Now, again, thinking about the grid system, really it's just about thinking how you're going to divide the page. So is it going to be portrait, landscape? Are you going to divide it up into 2 or 3 sections? Is it going to be read sort of vertically or horizontally? It's things like that you need to think about. How is the audience going to interact with your critical link page? So just for an example, this is a basic grid system that I've just created. As you can see, I've got the margins on the outside, and then I've split the page into 2 sections. One of the sections, the section on the left-hand side, as you can see, is slightly bigger than that of the right. So I'm just going to show you an example. So this is a critical link that I've just put together with that information from before. So it's all to do with the camera obscura. Now, look at how I've used the grid system here. So you can see on the left-hand side, the body of text is within that margin. That section of the grid. With the quote at the bottom, and on the right hand side where I've placed my photographs and also my subheading, you can see that fits carefully into that grid as well. So you can see how I've split the page up. It creates order, it makes it easier to read and view the work. Now, I've done some variations from that as well, again using the same grid system. On the middle design, you can see that I've put a big title behind the text saying the camera, the outline of the word camera. Again, it's all within that grid system that I've designed. So by placing your work in order using the grid system, it really does make it easier for the audience to view and read and interact with your work. And lastly, it's selecting your typeface. This is incredibly important. Again, you need to understand the differences in typefaces. So here are the two main typefaces. We can see we've got a serif, which is considered to be more traditional. It's got sort of as you can see, the flick on the end of the A. And then we've got the sans serif, which is sort of considered to be very modern, minimalistic, and also really does convey that modernist idea really well. So if it is that you're talking about something like the camera, or about a fact file or a process in general, the sans serif tends to be better. If you're looking at more traditional things, it may be that the serif font would be more appropriate for that. A lot of the time people do use sans serifs because they are more contemporary. Also, we will be uploading a video about this soon. But looking at tracking, leading and kerning, this again is very important. Make sure that you set your typography up correctly so it makes it easier for the viewer to read. We're now going to look at some examples of graphic design critical links. As we go through them, what I'll be asking you to do is rate them. Now, obviously, I understand that being on the screen, you might struggle to read the research, etc. So I suppose what I'm asking you to do is to reflect on whether or not you can see the influence of the designer in the layout of the critical link. So the first one we're going to start with is Molekid. So this particular artist, if you don't know who it is a collage artist. He does mix sort of handmade and digital approaches to collage. So when looking at this, you can really see the influence of the designer in the layout. You can see that this particular student has highlighted areas such as, the vectors that Molekid applies to his collages. This student has highlighted that. You can see that the student as well has tried to highlight the idea of part of it being handmade, so using that sort of paper finish at the back and the texture. I love the way this student has used the typography as well, the cutting of the letters. You can see there that they've also typed along a path. This particular link has been really carefully considered, and you can clearly see that the ideas of Molekid's work have been embedded into the layout. Here is a link to Jonathan Barnbrook. We do look at Barnbrook for his political work. So again, have a look at this and rate it from 1 to 9. This does have some interesting features to it. You can again see that the student has highlighted some of the vectors that we see a lot in Barnbrook's work, and they have selected very carefully a typeface that would mimic Barnbrook's. Now, Barnbrook did have a typeface. He does design many typefaces, but he did have one called Bastard, which is arguably one of his most famous typefaces, and you can see the left-hand page has been sort of put aside for that. Now, unless you are someone who does know Jonathan Barnbrook's work well, it might be that you don't know about that particular typeface, so it probably could have done with a little bit more research on that left-hand side. But on the right-hand side, I like the way the artist is the student has highlighted the idea of barcodes. We see a lot of them in Barnbrook's work, and I just like the way that they've highlighted the vector work. And I've decided to include the development that sort of followed this particular critical link. So this was the link and this was the student's development work. So you can see that the student has really been influenced by the typeface. So this particular critical link was researching the NASA branding as well as the Apollo mission branding as well. So what I mean by that is looking at the logos or the identifiers for NASA and all the Apollo missions. So on the face of this, it's a well-balanced critical link. I love the way that they've mimicked the idea of space in the layout. You can see it's very minimal, which is great. I absolutely love the way that they've laid out the planets. However, this is about branding. So when we look at the analysis, or is there any evidence of analysis here on the logos, I don't think there is. You may not know this, but Apollo, for every Apollo mission, they had a different logo, like a different identifier. So it would have been nice to have more examples of them. And also NASA did go through a number of sort of identity changes. So the logo did change over the course of, like, you know, the 50s to the 60s to the 90s. And it would have been nice to have some evidence of that as well. So this link as a layout is successful. You know, it's a great balanced layout, but when it comes to actual analysis, it could have been stronger. Here's a critical link to the work of David Carson. Again, David Carson, his use of typography is incredibly dynamic, complete opposite to modernism. So, you know, you could regard this as like a postmodernist approach to typography. So looking at this, you can clearly see that the student is trying to embed those ideas that David Carson uses with dynamic text into the layout. This particular piece was actually made first of all by hand. So you can do this by simply scanning a piece of paper, like so here, like he wrote, David Carson printed it and then went to the scan bed, and as the document was scanning, he moved it, and it creates this sort of blurred, moving, dynamic effect. You can imagine David Carson doing something similar to that. So on the whole, yes, there probably could have been a bit more research, but you can clearly see that the student understands the work of David Carson, and those ideas have been embedded into the critical link. I now want to just show you a example of a photography critical link, which was about Banksy, and this particular student was putting together a video. Now, he was working digitally, and obviously this year with our moderation and being digital, it might be some of you would want to do a website as a sketchbook, or want to do like an iBook as a sketchbook, which obviously opens up the opportunity to do things like video critical links. So have a watch of this and see what you think.
A previously unseen collection of satirical art and sculpture by the graffiti artist Banksy has been installed in a seaside town. The show is called Dismaland. It's taking place at a former Lido in Weston-super-Mare in Somerset. It opens to the public.
He's known as Banksy.
Maybe it means it's a bit of a joke.
Drawings of the graffiti master.
By midnight, it was clear that the shop would leave something.
Hopefully you've found this tutorial helpful. Just to finish, these are the things that you really should be thinking about when putting your critical links together. So first of all, you know, who the artist is, you know, when was the work produced, how was it produced, and ultimately why and what is the artist or designer trying to say within the work. And the way that we do that is through research, diagrams, quotes, and ultimately as well trying to sort of reflect those ideas into your layout. And if you can do that, you will have a very successful critical link.